The strange proposal. The battlefield was silent now. Smoke still rose from the broken machines, and the air smelled like burning metal. Captain Ethan Cole stepped carefully over the rubble, his pulse steady but his mind alert. The war between humans and the Salvarians had been going on for years, and he had seen enough battles to know one thing: never let your guard down. Then he heard it. A soft sound, barely a whisper, a groan. Ethan turned sharply, his weapon raised. Behind a fallen piece of wreckage, something moved. A survivor. He approached carefully and found a young Salvarian girl, wounded and struggling to breathe. Her silver skin shimmered under the flickering lights of a damaged drone, and her dark violet eyes locked onto him. Ethan hesitated. He had been trained to see the Salvarians as the enemy, but this one was just a girl. Her armor was cracked, her breathing weak. She wouldn't last long without help. She reached out a trembling hand and whispered, "You saved me. We must bond." Ethan blinked. Bond? What was she talking about? He chuckled, shaking his head. "You should save your strength. A rescue team will be here soon." But she didn't look amused. Her eyes glowed faintly, her voice firmer now. "You saved me. That means we must bond." Ethan frowned. "Look, I don't know what that means, but I'm not bonding with anyone." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, as if making a final decision, she closed her eyes and whispered something in her own language. Ethan sighed. This was not what he had signed up for. Still, he couldn't just leave her here to die. Against his better judgment, he lifted her into his arms and carried her toward the extraction point. Weeks later, Ethan had almost forgotten about the strange encounter. The girl had been taken by human medics, treated for her injuries, and sent back to her people. That was supposed to be the end of it. But then, on a quiet evening, as he sat in his quarters, a loud knock echoed through his door. Ding! Bang! Bang! Ethan frowned. Who the hell was that? He opened the door, and his breath caught in his throat. It was her. The Salvarian girl stood there, staring at him with those glowing violet eyes. She wasn't in armor anymore. Instead, she wore simple black robes, her silver skin smooth and unmarked. But something was different. She looked stronger, more determined. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, confused. She stepped inside, ignoring his question. "The bond has begun." Ethan groaned. "Not this again." She didn't flinch. "You do not understand, human. The bond is real. I cannot be apart from you." Ethan rubbed his temples. This was insane. "Listen, I don't know what kind of tradition this is, but I'm not part of it." Her expression remained calm, but her voice carried a quiet intensity. "You saved me. Our fates are now tied." Ethan sighed. "That's not how it works." She took a slow step closer, her violet eyes watching him carefully. "Have you felt different?" Ethan hesitated. Now that she mentioned it, strange things had been happening. He had been feeling off. Sometimes he could hear whispers in his head, like someone speaking just out of reach. Other times, he felt emotions that weren't his own: fear, pain, sadness. His dreams had changed too. He saw places he had never been, felt memories that didn't belong to him. Was it possible? No, that was crazy. "You are already connected to me," she said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "Deny it all you want, but the bond is there." Ethan exhaled sharply. "This is ridiculous. You can't just show up and declare we're bonded." She tilted her head. "Would you like me to leave?" Ethan opened his mouth to say yes. That would be the smart thing to do. The right thing. But something deep inside him, something he couldn't explain, whispered no. He shook his head, frustrated. "Look, if you're going to stay here, at least tell me your name." For the first time, she smiled, just a little. "My name is Soraya." Ethan sighed. This was going to be a long night. The unbreakable link. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his temples, trying to process everything. Soraya was here. She had found him, and she was saying things that made no sense. The bond has begun. What did that even mean? Soraya sat across the room, completely still, her violet eyes watching him like a predator studying prey. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't restless. She just sat there, as if she had all the time in the universe. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "All right, Soraya. Let's try this again. You show up at my door, saying we're bonded. What does that actually mean?" Soraya tilted her head. "Your people have no concept of it. That makes this difficult to explain. Try." She exhaled, slow and deliberate. "Selvarians form bonds when our lives are saved by another. It is an ancient connection, older than our written history. Once the bond is created, it cannot be broken. Not by distance, not by time. We are linked." Ethan shook his head. "You make it sound like some kind of magic." "It is not magic," she said simply. "It is nature. It is how my species survives. When we bond, we change." Ethan leaned forward, skeptical. "Change how?" She stared at him for a long moment. Then, finally, she said, "You are already feeling it, aren't you?" Ethan stiffened. The strange sensations, the whispers in his head, the dreams that weren't his. He hadn't told anyone about those things. "That's just a coincidence," he muttered. Soraya stood and took a step closer. "Is it?" Ethan could feel something in the air between them, a pressure, like an invisible thread pulling at him. He wanted to move away, but at the same time, some part of him wanted to move closer. "I don't believe in this bond nonsense," he said, standing up abruptly. "I saved your life. That's all. You don't owe me anything, and you definitely don't have to be here." Soraya didn't react. "I must be here," she said softly. "The bond is not a choice. I did not choose this any more than you did." Ethan groaned and turned away. This was ridiculous. He was a soldier, a man of logic and reason. He wasn't going to fall for some alien superstition. And yet, his head throbbed. He could feel her presence, even when he wasn't looking at her. Strange occurrences. Over the next few days, the weirdness only got worse. It started small. Ethan would reach for his coffee in the morning and feel an odd tug in his mind, an instinct that told him Soraya was hungry. When she got a small cut on her hand, a sharp sting ran across his own skin for a brief second, even though there was no wound. And then the voices came. Not loud, not words, but whispers. When he slept, he saw images of places he had never been. Tall, silver trees under a twin-moon sky, a great palace made of dark stone, halls filled with glowing symbols. He saw her standing at the edge of a massive canyon, watching a battle rage below. He woke up in a cold sweat. It wasn't his dream. It was hers. Soraya sat in the corner of his room, her violet eyes half closed, meditating. When she opened them, she spoke without hesitation. "You saw my memories." Ethan shivered. "That's not possible." She gave him a knowing look. And yet, it happened. A dangerous discovery. Ethan decided to get answers. He contacted a scientist he trusted, a human specialist in alien biology, Dr. Warren Blake. The older man listened carefully as Ethan described what was happening. After a long silence, Dr. Blake sighed. "I've heard of something like this before," he admitted. Ethan frowned. "You have?" "Not in humans," Blake clarified. "But in certain telepathic species, bonds like this are real. I always thought it was a myth. But if what you're saying is true, then what?" Ethan pressed. Blake hesitated. Then he looked Ethan in the eye. "Then you might be linked to her for the rest of your life." Ethan's stomach dropped. "No, there has to be a way to break it." Blake shook his head. "Not that I know of. If this is what I think it is, then breaking it would be dangerous." "How dangerous?" Blake hesitated. "Well, In most cases, when one dies, so does the other. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. You're telling me I'm connected to her forever? If she dies, I die. Blake rubbed his temples. I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't take the risk. Ethan turned and stormed out of the lab, his mind racing. He needed answers. He needed a way out of this. But deep down, something told him this bond wasn't something he could just walk away from. And worse, somewhere in the far reaches of space, someone else knew about it. Someone who was watching, waiting. And they weren't going to let Ethan and Soraya stay bonded for long. The fight against destiny. Ethan paced in his quarters, his mind spinning. The bond with Soraya was real. He could feel it, deep in his bones. The whispers that used to be distant now rang in his head like a constant hum. Her thoughts were invading his own, her emotions seeping into his. He couldn't escape it. One minute he'd be eating dinner, and the next, he'd feel a sudden spike of fear, a sharp, gut-wrenching terror coming from her. He couldn't explain it, but he knew when something was wrong with her. He had tried to ignore it at first, brushing it off as stress, or the byproduct of a long battle. But it wasn't that. This bond between them was changing him. Soraya was everywhere, in his mind, in his dreams, in his body. Even when she wasn't physically near him, it was like a part of him was always aware of her. And that scared him. Why does this have to be so complicated? Ethan muttered under his breath, rubbing his eyes. He turned toward the window and looked out at the stars. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Soraya. She stood there, her posture straight, but her face was tight with concern. Ethan, I need to speak with you. He swallowed hard. About what? Her eyes flickered toward the floor for a brief moment. The bond is growing stronger. We need to prepare. Ethan's heart skipped. Prepare for what? She stepped inside, her eyes locking with his. They're coming. Ethan froze. Who? Her expression was grim. The Korthar. They are a powerful faction from my home world. They believe that all Zelvarians who form bonds with humans are weak, and they want to end the connection. Ethan's stomach sank. The Korthar were ruthless, known for their bloodthirsty ways. If they were involved, things were about to get a lot worse. How did they know about us? He asked, his voice steady, but his mind racing. Soraya sighed. My people are not the only ones with the power of the bond. The Korthar have it as well. They can sense when a bond forms. They see it as a threat. They think the human who bonds with us will become a weapon, one strong enough to shift the balance of the universe. Ethan shook his head. I don't want to be anyone's weapon. I know, Soraya said softly, but they won't give us a choice. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing again. The room felt like it was closing in on him. I don't care about this bond. I didn't ask for it, he said sharply, though his own words rang hollow in his ears. Soraya's face softened. I did not ask for this either, but we are tied now. I can feel your emotions. I feel your pain, your frustration, your fear. Ethan stopped pacing, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing. So you can read me. You know everything I'm thinking. No, she replied softly. But I can sense your energy. I can feel your heart beating faster, the tension in your body when you're upset. It's like I can reach into your soul. Ethan looked away. He didn't want her to feel him. That's not the worst of it, Soraya continued. The Korthar will come for us soon, and when they do, they'll want to tear us apart. If they succeed, the bond will shatter, and we will both be lost. Ethan clenched his fists. No way was he going to let that happen. He knew he had no choice but to face this head-on. If Soraya was right, they were about to be hunted, and they didn't have much time. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Ethan immediately turned, instincts kicking in. A group of soldiers entered the room. Familiar faces, but there was no recognition in their eyes. One of them, Captain Jace, looked at him coldly. "We need to talk, Cole." Ethan stiffened. He didn't like the way Jace was looking at him. "I don't have time for games, Jace." "What's this about?" Captain Jace's face twisted in disgust. "You've been compromised." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Jace stepped forward, pulling out a small glowing device. It was a tracking beacon. Ethan had seen it used by military commanders before, when they wanted to keep tabs on a target. "You've been marked. The Korthar know where you are." Jace's voice was filled with contempt. "And they'll be here soon." Ethan stepped forward, grabbing Jace's collar. "What do you know about this?" he growled. Jace jerked back. "We were told to watch you. The higher-ups suspect something, but they didn't realize just how dangerous it is." Soraya stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "I will not let you separate us. This bond is stronger than you think." Jace sneered. "You're both fools. The Korthar will destroy you. You have no idea what you're up against." Ethan turned to Soraya, the tension rising in his chest. She could sense his emotions, his rising anger. He didn't know what to do. The fight against the Korthar was no longer just a battle of strength. It was a battle for survival. "Get ready," Soraya said quietly, her voice filled with determination. "They'll be here soon." Ethan nodded, gripping his weapon tightly. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting Soraya, about protecting the bond that had tied them together. He wasn't going to let anyone break it, no matter the cost. The Korthar were coming, and Ethan would fight until his last breath. The hidden truth. The days passed in a blur of urgency. Ethan didn't sleep much anymore. Each time he closed his eyes, the whispers from the bond became louder, faster, more frantic, and more real. It was like they were being pulled deeper into each other, and there was no escaping it. Soraya wasn't making it any easier. She had become a constant presence in his life. She was always close by, her gaze steady, her presence quiet but undeniable. At times, it felt like she was inside his head, sensing his every move before he even made it. "Can you stop doing that?" Ethan snapped one day, looking at her as he tried to concentrate on his work. She didn't even flinch. "I cannot help it. The bond is becoming stronger. Our thoughts are intertwined." Ethan gritted his teeth. He needed to regain control. The idea of being forever connected to her terrified him. Yet there was also something else, something unspoken that made him feel drawn to her, an unexplainable pull in his chest. And that scared him too. "Is it just me?" Ethan muttered to himself, looking out the window at the distant stars. "Or is this whole thing growing out of control?" But before Soraya could answer, a low hum echoed through the building, followed by a sudden shudder. The alarms went off. Ethan and Soraya exchanged a look, their bond humming with intensity. The Korthar had arrived. The very threat they had been dreading was now on their doorstep. "Get ready," Ethan said, his voice sharp and clear. "We can't let them take you. Not now." Soraya nodded without hesitation, but her eyes held something darker now, something Ethan hadn't seen before. Fear. It was a strange thing to witness, considering how strong she had appeared all this time. The bond had made them connected, but it also made them vulnerable. The truth about the bond. As the chaos unfolded outside the compound, Ethan and Soraya retreated into the underground hallways, following a series of emergency protocols. The ship's defenses were strong, but they wouldn't hold forever. The Korthar were relentless. They would breach the walls. "Soraya, we need to talk," Ethan said, his voice lower now, strained from the stress of everything happening around them. She looked at him, her violet eyes narrowed. "We don't have time for words. They'll be here soon." But Ethan wasn't going to let it go. There were things he needed to know, things that didn't add up. "I don't care about them. I care about you," he said, his words surprising even himself. Soraya's gaze softened for a brief moment, but she didn't say anything. She turned away, walking a few paces before pausing. You must understand, Ethan. The bond is more than just a link. It's a transformation. Ethan's brow furrowed. Transformation? What do you mean by that? She turned back to him, her expression serious. When the bond is fully formed, both of us change. It's not just emotional or physical. It alters our very essence. Ethan stared at her, confused. Essence? You mean like our biology? Yes, she replied, her voice softer now. It's why we're being hunted. It's why you feel stronger, faster, more aware. The bond affects everything. Your instincts, your power, your senses, and most importantly. She hesitated. Most importantly what? Ethan demanded, the tension in his chest growing. Soraya finally met his gaze, her eyes filled with something he hadn't expected. Regret. You will stop being human, Ethan. Ethan felt a cold chill run through him, as if the very air around him had frozen. His stomach tightened. What? What do you mean? I can't stop being human. I'm a soldier, a captain. She took a step toward him, her eyes filled with the weight of centuries-old knowledge. That's exactly it. The bond. It alters the very core of what you are. The Korthar know this, and that's why they're hunting us. When the bond fully merges, you will no longer be just human. You will become something more. Ethan's mind reeled. He felt dizzy, like the room was spinning around him. He had always been in control of his own life, his destiny. But now, something more. He repeated slowly, trying to wrap his head around what she was saying. Soraya nodded, her face etched with deep concern. The power of the bond gives you abilities you don't yet understand. You may be stronger than even I am. But with that strength comes a terrible risk. If you lose control, if you let the bond overtake you, you could lose everything. Yourself, your humanity. Ethan stepped back, his heart racing. I'm not some alien weapon, Soraya. I didn't ask for this either, she said, a soft sadness in her voice. But it's happening. And when the bond is complete, you'll be able to feel my thoughts, my emotions, just as I can feel yours. Ethan looked away, his head filled with 1,000 questions. He didn't know if he could handle this. But one thing was clear now. He had no choice. A growing threat. The alarms blared louder as the ground shook again. The Korthar were here. Ethan and Soraya exchanged one last look before grabbing their weapons and heading for the door. The ship was already on high alert. Guards were stationed at every exit, and the weapon systems had been activated. But none of it mattered. The Korthar were too powerful. Ethan knew the truth now. The bond wasn't just about connection. It was a transformation, and one that could either save them or destroy them. They were about to face the full weight of their enemies. And as the first explosion echoed through the compound, Ethan realized something else. The Korthar were here for them, not just Soraya. They wanted him. The ultimate chase. The air was thick with tension. The lights flickered as explosions rocked the ship's hull, sending waves of vibration through the walls. Ethan's pulse raced, but it wasn't just fear that made his heart pound. It was the bond. It pulsed in his veins, a constant, throbbing reminder of what was at stake. Beside him, Soraya was silent, her face set in grim determination. Her violet eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the chaos around them. She was ready. Ready to fight. Ready to face whatever the Korthar had in store for them. But Ethan wasn't sure he was ready. He had been trained for combat, yes, but this was something else. His body felt different now. The bond between them had done something to him. His reflexes were sharper, his vision clearer. He could feel the slightest changes in Soraya's emotions, and with them, the undeniable instinct to protect her. Soraya, Ethan said, his voice steady but his mind a swirl of conflicting thoughts. We need to move. We can't stay here. She nodded. I know. The door behind them exploded open with a deafening crash, and soldiers in dark armor stormed into the room. The Korthar had found them. Ethan's body reacted before his mind could catch up. His weapon was in his hand in a split second, and he was moving before he even knew it. The first soldier to charge at him was thrown back against the wall with a force that sent cracks through the metal. Ethan barely registered the movement. His instincts had already taken over. "Ethan." Soraya's voice cut through his daze. "Focus." He blinked, feeling the pull of her voice, her emotions, and the bond between them. It was like a thread that stretched between them, guiding him, sharpening his awareness. But the Korthar weren't done. They weren't just here to capture Soraya. They were here to destroy everything. And Ethan was their prime target now. The chase begins. Ethan and Soraya ran through the darkened halls of the ship, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. The Korthar soldiers were fast, relentless, and had far more advanced weapons than anything the humans had. Yet, despite the odds, Ethan felt the bond with Soraya strengthen. He could feel her fear, her anxiety, but also her unwavering resolve. It was like a flame inside him, burning brighter the longer they ran. "We need to get to the escape pods," Ethan shouted, taking a sharp turn into a narrow corridor. Soraya nodded, her breath shallow but steady. "I know where they are." Just as they reached the door to the escape pods, a blast sent them both sprawling to the ground. The wall beside them exploded, throwing debris everywhere. The Korthar general stepped through the smoke, his armor glowing faintly with an eerie green light. His eyes locked onto Ethan with cold, merciless determination. "You cannot run from this," the general said, his voice deep and menacing. "The bond between you is a threat to everything we have worked for. You will be eliminated." Ethan struggled to his feet, the bond throbbing violently in his chest. He could feel Soraya's panic, her fear for both of them. But he also felt something else. Anger, a surge of pure, unrelenting rage that seemed to come from deep within him. Something that wasn't entirely his. The general raised his weapon, a sleek energy rifle. Ethan had no time to think. He acted on instinct. In a blur of motion, he rushed forward, using the newfound strength from the bond to dodge the blast. With a twist of his body, he threw a punch that landed squarely in the general's chest. The force of the blow sent the alien soldier crashing to the floor, his weapon skittering across the floor. "Ethan, we don't have time for this," Soraya shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the escape pods. "We need to leave now." But it was too late. The general wasn't the only threat. More Korthar soldiers poured into the room, their weapons drawn, ready to strike. Ethan's mind raced. He knew they couldn't take them all on. Not like this. Not with only one escape pod left. He glanced at Soraya. Her eyes were full of determination, but he could feel her fear too. She was terrified, but not for herself. For him. She knew the bond was taking over, and with each passing second, it was becoming harder to separate their emotions, their thoughts, their very being. "We have to make it," Ethan muttered, trying to steady his breath. "For us." Soraya nodded, her grip tightening on his arm. "I won't let them take you." Just as the first blast shot toward them, Ethan pushed Soraya into the pod. The blast missed by inches, and he barely managed to dive in after her, slamming the door shut just in time. The pod shot out into space, leaving the ship behind. They were free. For now. But Ethan knew it wasn't over. The Korthar would follow. They always did. A moment of peace. As the pod drifted into the cold void of space, Ethan leaned back, trying to catch his breath. His body was still thrumming with adrenaline, the effects of the bond overwhelming him. He could feel Soraya beside him, her presence like a constant hum in his mind. "Are you all right?" Soraya asked quietly, her voice soft. Ethan looked at her, his breath catching. She was so close. The bond made it impossible to escape her, but it wasn't just that. It was something else. He had grown used to her presence, her emotions, and his own feelings toward her. He couldn't deny it anymore. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice betrayed him. "But I don't think we're safe yet." Soraya nodded slowly, her face filled with worry. "The Korthar will never stop hunting us. We've only just begun to see the consequences of the bond." Ethan glanced out the small viewport. The stars outside seemed endless, but he knew that somewhere, out there, the Korthar were waiting. They would come. And when they did, he and Soraya would have to face the truth about the bond, and the future it would create. The escape pod drifted, but Ethan's mind raced. He had made a promise to Soraya that he would protect her. But now, it seemed, they had no choice but to protect each other. Whatever happened next, they were in this together. The final stand. The escape pod drifted in the void, surrounded by an eerie silence that made Ethan's skin crawl. They had fled the Korthar, barely escaping with their lives. But he knew this wasn't over. Soraya sat across from him in the cramped space, her violet eyes unfocused, her breathing controlled. She was meditating, or at least trying to stabilize the bond. Ethan had stopped fighting it. He had spent too much time denying the truth, resisting the link between them. But now, with the Korthar hunting them and the bond changing him in ways he couldn't understand, there was no point in denial. Something inside him had shifted. He could feel Soraya without even looking at her. Not just her presence, her emotions, her thoughts. A memory surfaced in his mind, one that wasn't his. A battlefield. The skies of a distant planet burning. A younger Soraya standing at the center of the chaos, covered in dust and blood. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't running. She was fighting. Ethan shook his head, snapping out of the vision. His heart pounded. "Soraya," he said, his voice low, unsure. "That memory." "I know," she whispered, finally opening her eyes. He exhaled sharply. "You're doing this, aren't you? Pushing your thoughts into my mind." She hesitated. "Not on purpose. The bond is growing. And with it, our connection." Ethan leaned back against the pod's cold metal wall, rubbing his temples. He could feel something inside him shifting, stretching, changing. His strength had increased. His reflexes were sharper. His awareness of his surroundings had grown so intense it was almost unnatural. And deep inside, something darker was stirring. Something that wasn't human. "Soraya, what happens when the bond completes?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but laced with unease. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand over his. The moment their skin touched, a rush of power surged through him. Raw, overwhelming, unlike anything he had ever felt before. Soraya's voice was barely a whisper. "When the bond completes, Ethan, you won't be the same." The Korthar's trap. A loud beeping filled the escape pod, pulling Ethan out of his thoughts. A ship was approaching. His instincts flared. It wasn't human. Soraya's eyes widened. "They found us." Ethan moved fast, grabbing the pod's manual controls. He spun them, trying to steer, but there was nowhere to run. They were in open space. A massive Korthar warship loomed ahead, its dark hull blending with the void. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had seen these ships before in battle, fortresses of destruction, equipped with weapons powerful enough to tear through entire fleets. The pod's console flickered. A transmission was coming through. A deep, menacing voice filled the small cabin. "You cannot escape your fate, Bonded One. Surrender or be destroyed." Ethan's hands tightened around the controls. He could feel the rage inside him boiling, a fury that wasn't entirely his own. It was the bond. It was Soraya's instincts merging with his. "We're not surrendering," Ethan growled. Soraya met his gaze. "Then we fight. The fight for survival." The escape pod shuddered as the warship's tractor beam pulled them in. Ethan's mind raced. They couldn't let themselves be captured. The Korthar would rip them apart, sever the bond, and in doing so, kill them both. He turned to Soraya. "Do you trust me?" She nodded. "With everything." He exhaled sharply. Good. The moment the tractor beam pulled them into the warship's hangar, Ethan acted. Using his enhanced speed, he ripped open the emergency hatch, moving before the Korthor soldiers could react. His mind was sharp, too sharp. He could see every movement before it happened, sensed the attacks before they came. It was the Bond. The Korthor fired at him, but Ethan dodged faster than he should have been able to. He weaved through the chaos, taking down 2 soldiers with brutal efficiency. His strength was inhuman now. Soraya fought beside him, moving with an elegant precision that mirrored his. They weren't just 2 people anymore. They were one. The Korthor realized their mistake too late. They had expected to fight a human and an alien. Instead, they were fighting something else entirely. The transformation. The deeper they fought into the warship, the more Ethan felt it. The bond, the change, the transformation. His vision blurred for a second, then sharpened. His muscles pulsed with raw power. He could hear things he shouldn't be able to hear, the distant murmurs of the Korthor, their panicked thoughts. And then it happened. A Korthor soldier charged him, blade raised. Ethan moved to counter, but his arm didn't feel like his own. A surge of energy erupted from his palm. A shockwave blasted outwards, sending the Korthor flying. The walls cracked. The lights flickered. The air itself seemed to ripple around him. Ethan staggered back, his breath ragged. He stared at his own hands. Soraya was watching him, eyes wide. It's happening. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. He could feel it. The last piece of his humanity slipping. The bond was consuming him. No, he whispered. I can't. Soraya stepped closer, reaching out. Ethan, listen to me. You're not losing yourself. You're becoming something greater. You're becoming one of us. His mind screamed in denial, but his body, his instincts, told a different story. The Korthor leader stood before them now, a cruel smile on his face. You think you have won, he sneered. The bond will destroy him, just as it has destroyed others before him. Ethan felt the surge of energy in his veins. His body felt lighter, faster, stronger. But was he still Ethan? Or was he becoming something else? Soraya's voice was calm, steady. You are still you, and together, we are unstoppable. Ethan took a deep breath. He had a choice, to fight against the transformation, or to embrace it. And as the Korthor raised their weapons again, Ethan made his decision. He clenched his fists and unleashed the full power of the bond. The new beginning. The warship trembled as energy pulsed through the air. The Korthor soldiers staggered back, their expressions shifting from confidence to terror. Ethan stood at the center of the battlefield, his body glowing with power. The transformation was complete. He could feel everything. The bond with Soraya was no longer just a connection. It was a force, a power that burned through his veins like fire. His senses had sharpened beyond human limits. He could hear the panicked heartbeats of the Korthor soldiers, feel the weight of their fear. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what he had become. Soraya was beside him, her presence grounding him, guiding him. They were no longer separate beings. They were one. The Korthor leader stepped forward, his dark armor gleaming under the flickering lights. He wasn't afraid. Not yet. I warned you, the leader sneered, gripping his weapon tightly. The bond is a curse. It does not make you stronger. It makes you weak. Ethan lifted his gaze, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was different. Stronger. Deeper. You don't understand, do you? Ethan took a step forward, and the entire room seemed to shift around him. The bond isn't a weakness. It's the one thing you fear the most. The Korthor leader snarled, raising his weapon. I fear nothing. Ethan didn't even move. In the blink of an eye, Soraya vanished. 1 second she was beside him. The next she was behind the Korthor soldiers, her twin daggers flashing. They didn't even have time to react. Ethan felt everything she felt. Her heartbeat, her movements, her focus. He could see through her eyes, sense her every thought. And she could feel his. He didn't need to speak, didn't need to signal. They moved together. The Korthar fired their weapons, but Ethan was faster. He dodged the blasts with ease, closing the distance in the blink of an eye. His body moved like it had no limits. He struck with precision, every movement guided by instinct. One by one, the Korthar fell. The leader was the last one standing. For the first time, he hesitated. Ethan could sense his doubt, his fear. "Go on," Ethan said coldly, stepping closer. "Fight me." The leader bared his teeth. He attacked. Ethan barely blinked as he caught the blade in his bare hand. The energy surged through his skin, but it didn't burn. It felt familiar. His body had changed. He had changed. With a single movement, Ethan twisted the blade away and drove his fist into the leader's chest. The impact sent a shockwave through the room. The Korthar was thrown back, smashing into the far wall. He didn't get up. Silence filled the hangar. The remaining Korthar soldiers, seeing their leader defeated, hesitated. Their fear was palpable. Ethan took a deep breath, the power inside him finally settling. The fight was over. What happens now? Soraya stood beside him, breathing heavily. The battle had pushed them to their limits, but they had survived. Ethan looked at his hands, still glowing faintly with energy. He flexed his fingers, feeling the raw strength coursing through him. "What am I now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Soraya placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and steady. "You are still you, Ethan," she said softly, "but you are also more." Ethan met her gaze, searching for something. Reassurance, understanding. Could he go back? Would he ever be human again? A part of him already knew the answer. The Ethan Cole that had stepped onto that battlefield no longer existed. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. A new path. The warship was in ruins. The surviving Korthar fled, their forces scattered. Ethan and Soraya stood at the bridge, looking out at the vastness of space. "We need to leave," Soraya said quietly. "There will be more of them." Ethan nodded. He knew this wasn't the end. The Korthar weren't going to stop. They had tried to break the bond, to destroy it, and they had failed. "They'll come for us again," Ethan said. Soraya's gaze was steady. "Then we'll be ready." He turned to her, studying her face. She had been right all along. The bond wasn't a curse. It wasn't a weakness. It was their greatest strength. And together, they were unstoppable. Ethan reached out, taking her hand in his. The bond pulsed between them, a steady rhythm that felt like it had always been there. A new journey was beginning. And this time, he wasn't facing it alone.